God speaks to us in beauty. God shows up for us in beauty. Or to say it another way, beauty is God's love language. If you want biblical evidence, there's plenty of it in the Psalms. We read one of many creation psalms this morning. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Just the sight of natural beauty and grandeur made the psalmist contemplate the most existential question and pose that question to God. Who are we that you love and care for us so much? A part of this sermon I happened to write sitting outdoors in the shade, breeze blowing by Cook's Creek and a pair of mallards swimming by. I didn't set out to do that because of the topic. It's just where I found myself working, and maybe the Spirit drew me there. But how many times have you heard someone say, or have you yourself said, the place where I experience God's presence most closely, where I hear the voice of God most clearly, is out in nature, watching a sunset, gazing on purple mountains, or listening to the roar of the ocean, or deep in the quiet of a forest. And last night I was at the Bach Festival choir, singing in the choir, and we sang Haydn's great oratorio, The Creation. The heavens are telling the glory of God. With wonders of his work resounds the firmament. In every land is known the word. Every ear will hearken, never tongue be dumb. I was overwhelmed by that experience of majesty last night, and the divine voice, I think, is still echoing in my mind and spirit. Well, God speaks to us in creation, in nature, and I believe that's so not just because it's usually quiet out in nature, so we can hear our thoughts better, although that's part of the equation. It's the actual aesthetics. It's the beauty. It's the wondrous order of the created world, the symmetry or asymmetry of a leaf or a flower or a butterfly. It's the grace of a deer, of a hummingbird. Now, I say all this about beauty and aesthetics and existential mysteries because I'm preaching on a topic that usually uses the other side of the brain, the Trinity, a topic known mostly by the rational, philosophical, and intellectual arguments that it has produced. Throughout church history, when the Trinity is spoken of, usually it's someone trying to explain it in words or analogies, trying to put it into some intelligible, rational framework, trying to say it in a way that we can get our heads around it, at least the left side of our heads, our left brain logical ways of thinking. And it's been this way for eons. Back in the 4th century, mid-300s, common people on the streets were getting into arguments with their neighbors over the Trinity. It was a big deal, and that's an understatement. There was a huge theological controversy at the time between Arius and Athanasius. And Arius decided to put his more radical ideas to music so they could spread more easily among the common people in the streets, and that they did. The conflict was most heated in Alexandria, Egypt, where these two theologians lived, but it spread throughout the Roman Empire. People on the streets were singing ditties based on popular tunes, the words claiming that the Father alone was true God, but that the Son was neither co-eternal nor uncreated, since he proceeded from the Father. Sounds like a catchy song, doesn't it? One vegetable seller I read, when giving customers what they ordered at the market, would throw in for free an unsolicited theological discourse on whether the Father was greater than the Son. So heated was the public debate that Emperor Constantine summoned a council to Nicaea in modern-day Turkey to settle these questions. And after months of negotiations, they came up with the Nicene Creed of 325 AD. That settled some basics about the divinity of the Son, but it didn't settle all the questions about the Trinity. There was another council in 381 and 451 and 589, held in Constantinople and Chalcedon and Toledo, respectively. Every generation or two, they had to go through the arguments again. Popes and kings and emperors got into the fight, and they still didn't get it all figured out. So in 1054, the whole Christian world split in two, east and west. Clearly, there was something important at stake. Maybe to us, some arguments sound like parsing a word or two in a creed, but the arguments meant something to those arguing them. Now, this morning, it's not, of course, my intent to sort out the substance of all those arguments. I don't have enough time in a 20-minute sermon to outline all the fine points. And I have a basic commitment in my preaching not to bore you to tears. But I'm not dismissing the significance of theological arguments, because I think theological debate is important. But I want to speak of the Trinity with a language other than logic and rationality. I want to speak of the beauty of the Trinity. We open this service with a hymn that you may or may not have paid much attention to, since we were still in the gathering mode and still getting settled into our space. So turn again to number 2 in the blue hymnal. This is an old Mennonite hymn that borrows heavily from the aesthetic sensibilities of high church liturgies. Notice all the phrases in this hymn that sound like it could have been written by a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox hymn writer, starting with the phrase, holy place, and then perfumes sweet, golden censers, fire of sacrifice, saints bending, holy light, holy bread, and other words and metaphors that conjure up a pure sensory experience of worship. Smells and bells, if you will. Now for the real surprise, look at the date and author of the text at the bottom. 1901, S.F. Kaufman. S.F. Kaufman was born at Dale Enterprise, a few miles out, US 33 from here, although he grew up mostly in Elkhart, Indiana, and raised his family in Ontario. It was in 1901, the year he wrote this hymn, that back here in his home community, Virginia Mennonites divided over several issues of worship order, like Sunday school, ordination by lot, and revival meetings. Kaufman's father was a famous revival preacher among the Mennonites. Well, that particular division formed the Old Order Mennonite group in this area, which continues to worship to this day using the same old order of things, same worship practices, same hymnal, same unadorned meeting places. If you've ever been inside Pleasant View Old Order Mennonite Church, just west of Dayton, built in 1902, then you know exactly what all Mennonite worship spaces in our area looked like the year this hymn was written. There were no golden censers to be found, no incense, no holy fire or holy light or holy bread. They were and are plain places. White walls, wooden benches, only a few cushions, no pictures on the wall, no crosses, no religious symbols of any kind. Yet, S.F. Kaufman, whose faith took shape in a stark and stripped-down worship space like that, was able to write this hymn. With highly sensory metaphors, he could conjure up the visual and oral and olfactory and tactile experience of beauty, the beauty of the worship of the triune God. That's a paradox that strikes me every time we sing this hymn. Someday I want to ask some of my old order friends if they know this hymn and what the words conjure up for them. I know they appreciate beauty, but it's certainly expressed differently in their community. But back to the aesthetics of the Trinity. Why focus on beauty? Brian Zond is a pastor, author, and speaker that I respect. I've heard him in person several times and been inspired by his preaching and teaching. He's the pastor of a large, non-denominational church in Missouri, and he preaches a biblical gospel of peace. Has a passion for Christ-centered social justice. Kind of an outlier among well-known evangelical preachers, a friend of Anabaptists, and making an impact in the Christian world. He's written a book entitled, "Beauty Will Save the World: Rediscovering the Allure and Mystery of Christianity." He draws on the ancient traditions of artists, sages, and theologians who connect the beautiful with the sacred, who see in our art a longing for God. He suggests that we live in a day when pragmatism and utilitarian morals have largely displaced beauty as a value. Here's a part of what he wrote, and I quote, "We are generally more accustomed to defend Christianity in terms of its truth and goodness, but beauty also belongs to the Christian faith. And beauty has a way of sneaking past our defenses and speaking to us in unique ways. Everything about Jesus Christ is beautiful. His life, his miracles, his grace, his teaching, even his death, and certainly his resurrection, they are all inimitably beautiful. A Christianity," and I'm continuing the quote, "a Christianity enhanced by this beauty, formed by this beauty, and reflecting this beauty, has the opportunity to present to a skeptical and jaded world an aspect of the gospel that has been too rare for far too long. Where truth and goodness fail to win an audience, beauty may once again captivate and draw those it enchants into the kingdom of saving grace." And he adds, "Our task is not to protest the world into a certain moral conformity, but to attract the world to the saving beauty of Christ. We do this best by enacting a beautiful presence within the world." The Western Church has had for 4 centuries of viewing salvation in a mechanistic manner, presenting it as a plan, system, or formula. It would be much better if we would return to viewing salvation as a beautiful song we sing. I find those ideas pretty compelling. I think the same thing could be said about the doctrine of the Trinity. It's something of beauty to take in, to contemplate with wonder and awe. It's not something to win a rational argument about. The doctrine of the Trinity is simply a way for us to describe in words what we experience when we start to inhabit the gospel story. When we dwell in the Scriptures and start to grasp the story of God and God's people. What is more beautiful than the affirmation of faith that we heard from Romans 5 this morning? Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Not only that, but we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. Because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. There is the Trinity. Not in a wordy, rational proposition, but in sublime words of exaltation. This is not, in Romans 5, a triangular flow chart of the Trinity, showing how neatly it all fits together and how Jesus Christ and the Spirit proceed from the Father, or is it begotten of the Father? No. The Apostle Paul, who can get pretty dense and wordy at other places, here is just overflowing with giddy praise for the God who shows up in grace and glory everywhere. It's like he's standing at the edge of a canyon, pointing to the west and saying, would you look at that sunset? It's just gorgeous. And Jesus himself spoke of the coming of the Spirit as a wonderful treasure to marvel over, not a new plan or formula to memorize. In fact, in our reading from John 16 this morning, it was almost like Jesus was warning us not to get caught in the weeds, but to enjoy the big picture. He said in verse 12 to the disciples, I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. In other words, don't worry about it. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. For he will not speak on his own, but will speak whatever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. So don't worry about it, Jesus said. The Holy Trinity is a thing of beauty. It's a beautiful thing to discover a God that meets us wherever we need to be met. God is the all-powerful and just creator of the infinite universe, and God comes and lives among us, moves into the neighborhood, shares our humanity, shares even our suffering and brokenness. And God is present with us by the Spirit in our very breath. God's Spirit shows up and does not leave us bereft, always and ever available to us. This, our one holy God, is both power and presence, shows justice and mercy, inhabits the material and spiritual. That is beautiful. It's just beautiful. It draws us in. It's alluring in the best sense of the word. Contemplating the Trinity is like examining a multifaceted gemstone that reflects the light in different colors and intensities depending on the angle from which you're viewing it. like a prism. The Trinity helps us see God from different angles, all beautiful in their own way. And speaking of aesthetics, just for the joy of it, we're going to sing a song that we sang last Sunday, on Pentecost Sunday. It worked for that Sunday, and it works for this one too, because it exalts in the delight of a multifaceted God, a God who shimmers like light shining through a prism. Sing the journey, the Green Book, number 16, Praise with Joy the World's Creator.